My ancestors were enslaved. Now I'm taking back what's ours. Oh, I'm Levi Lester, a senior at Howard University, and I just uncovered a family history that's flipped my world upside down. It started 3 months ago in my African American Studies capstone class. Our professor, Dr. Harriet Coleman, a brilliant woman with silver locks and eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom, assigned us a genealogy project. Your history didn't begin with chains, she told us, her voice carrying the weight of conviction. Dig deeper than the pain. Find your roots. So I did. I spent weeks in archives, digital databases, and on calls with distant relatives whose voices I'd never heard before. My grandmother Beatrice, we call her Big Mama, gave me a weathered Bible with family names scribbled in the margins, some so faded I needed a magnifying glass to read them. That's when I found it. My ancestors weren't just sharecroppers in Mississippi like I'd always been told, they owned land. A lot of it, nearly 200 acres in Yazoo County, Mississippi. And it wasn't given to them, they bought it. My great-great-great-grandfather, James Lester, and his wife Elaine, worked their fingers to the bone after emancipation. James would work from sunrise to sunset, then take on carpentry jobs by lamplight. Elaine would sew, cook, clean for wealthy families, and sell her preserves at the market. Every penny was saved, hidden away in a jar buried beneath the floorboards of their small cabin. By 1868, they had enough to buy land. The documents I found show they paid in full minus $1,200 for rich, fertile soil along the river. They built a home, planted crops, and started to build something for themselves and for us. But the Winstons, the family that had owned them before emancipation, couldn't stand to see it. Richard Winston, a man described in county records as of distinguished Southern heritage and temperament, fabricated debts, claimed James owed him for equipment and training during slavery. When James refused to pay, Winston used his connections with the local sheriff and judge to seize the land. There's a letter I found, written by Elaine to her sister. They came at night, torches and guns. James stood at the door, told me to take the children and run. I didn't want to leave him, but the little ones were crying. We hid in the swamp until morning. When we came back, our home was ashes. James was beaten so badly I scarce recognized him. Sheriff said we had 1 day to clear out or we'd be arrested for trespassing on Winston land. On our own land, sister. The land we paid for with our sweat and blood. Asterisk. The Lesters ended up as sharecroppers on the very land they once owned, trapped in a system barely distinguishable from the slavery they'd escaped. Working the Winston plantation, always in debt, never able to leave. But Elaine, she was fierce in her quiet way. She started teaching children at night in an old tobacco barn on the edge of the property. She'd stolen books from the Winston house while cleaning, taught herself to read better, then passed that knowledge on. That makeshift school educated 3 generations of black children in that county. In a journal entry I found in Howard's archives, Elaine wrote, "They can take our land. They can break our bodies. But they cannot have our minds. Education is the only thing they cannot steal, if we keep passing it along. One day, a child from this school will stand tall and take back what's ours." Asterisk. That child is me. I've found the documents, the land records, the proof. The Winstons are still around, still rich, still benefiting from what they stole. And I'm going to take it back. Update 1. I confronted the Winstons today. Drove 5 hours from D.C. down to Mississippi. To their historic family estate, a place that markets itself as a charming glimpse into the antebellum South, and hosts weddings for rich white couples looking for Southern charm. I wore my best suit, navy blue, crisp white shirt, my grandfather's tie pin. I wanted them to see me as what I am, educated, dignified, and dead serious. The current patriarch, Richard Winston IV, met me in what he called his study, a room filled with hunting trophies and books I doubt he's ever read. He's in his 60s, with that soft, pink look of privilege that's never known a hard day's work. His wife, Elizabeth, insisted on being present, hovering like I might steal the silver if left unsupervised. I laid out the documents on his mahogany desk, land deeds, tax records, court filings, all showing the legitimate purchase and fraudulent seizure. Mr. Winston, I said, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. These documents clearly show that my ancestors purchased this land legally and that your great-grandfather seized it through fraudulent claims of debt. I'm here to discuss how we might rectify this historical wrong. Winston barely glanced at the papers before leaning back in his leather chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Boy, he drawled, the word itself a whip, you think some old papers are gonna scare me? That land's been in the Winston family for generations. My daddy's daddy worked it, improved it, made it what it is. I felt my jaw clench. With respect, sir, generations of theft don't make ownership legitimate. My family built that land, paid for it with money they earned after slavery. Your ancestor stole it through fraud and intimidation. Elizabeth Winston stepped forward then, pearls clutched literally in one manicured hand. Don't you dare speak to my husband like that. Her voice was high, scandalized. After all we've done for your people. Why, we employ several black families right now. We donate to urban charities every Christmas. You people are never satisfied, she continued, color rising in her cheeks. Always looking for handouts, for someone to blame. This is ridiculous. I met her gaze steadily. We're satisfied with justice, Mrs. Winston. And that's what we're getting. This isn't about charity or handouts. It's about returning what was wrongfully taken. Richard Winston stood then, surprisingly spry for his age. I think we're done here. My family built this county. My grandfather was a senator. Who do you think the courts are going to believe? Some college boy with dusty papers or the Winston name? I gathered my documents slowly, deliberately. The truth doesn't expire, Mr. Winston. And justice might be delayed, but it's coming. That's when he pressed a button on his desk, and a security guard appeared, a young black man who couldn't meet my eyes as he escorted me out. As I was leaving, Winston called after me, you'd be smart to let sleeping dogs lie, boy. Some stories are better left in the past. I turned at the door. My great-great-great-grandmother Elaine once wrote that one day, a child from her school would stand tall and take back what's ours. I am that child, Mr. Winston. And I don't frighten easily. The door closed in my face, but I walked away with my head high. They're scared. I could see it beneath the bluster. They know I'm not going away. Update 2. I've found allies in this fight, and our coalition is growing stronger every day. After the confrontation at the Winston estate, I reached out to the Southern Justice Law Center, a nonprofit that specializes in cases of historical land theft and reparations. My case landed on the desk of Aisha Johnson, a formidable attorney with 15 years of experience in land rights cases. The evidence you've gathered is extraordinary, Mr. Lester, she said during our first meeting, her fingers tracing the fragile documents with reverence. Her office walls were covered with framed court victories, each representing land returned, justice served. Most families don't have this level of documentation. Your great-great-great-grandmother Elaine must have been not just educated but forward-thinking enough to preserve these records. But, I could hear the hesitation in her voice. The Winstons have power, she continued, adjusting her glasses. They've donated to every judge's campaign in that county for the last century. Richard Winston's cousin sits on the state Supreme Court. This won't be easy or quick. I leaned forward. I didn't expect easy, Ms. Johnson. I expected right. She smiled then, a slow spread of approval. Then we're going to get along just fine. We've also enlisted Dr. Marcus Washington, a historian from Tougaloo College who specializes in post-Civil War land ownership among freed people. He's been poring over county records, building a comprehensive picture of the systematic land theft that occurred. What happened to your family wasn't unusual, sadly, Dr. Washington explained as we walked through the college archives. He's a tall man with a professorial air, but his eyes burn with the passion of an activist. The records show a clear pattern of land theft after the Civil War. Over 40 million acres were initially owned by freed Black Americans. By 1910, 90% of that land had been stolen through violence, fraudulent debt, or legal manipulation. He paused before a map he'd created, showing the Winston plantation boundaries expanding over decades, swallowing up Black-owned parcels one by one. It's a national disgrace, he said quietly. But cases like yours are how we begin to address it. Not just for your family, but as precedent. Perhaps most surprisingly, I've found allies among some of the Winstons' former workers. After word got out about my claim, I was approached by an elderly man named Joseph Taylor, who had worked on the Winston plantation for over 40 years before retiring. We met at his small church, and he seemed nervous, constantly glancing at the windows as if expecting to be seen. My granddaddy told me about what they did to your people, he whispered, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he accepted the cup of tea I offered. The Lesters were respected round here. That schoolhouse your great-great-great-grandmother started. It educated my granddaddy, taught him letters when it was dangerous to do so. His eyes, clouded with cataracts but sharp with memory, met mine. The Winstons, they were cruel in those days. Still are, in different ways. Pay as little as they can get away with. Fire anyone who talks union. My daughter lost her job there last year for asking for sick leave. He hesitated, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. This might help you. It's a map my granddaddy drew, showing where the original Lester boundaries were. He remembered 'cause he helped your ancestors harvest their first crop there as a boy. Said it was the proudest day, working for black owners instead of white ones. The map, though amateur, corresponded perfectly with the legal descriptions in our documents. Why are you helping me? I asked as he prepared to leave. The Winstons could make trouble for you. Joseph Taylor stood straighter, something of his younger self visible in his posture. Because it's time, been time. And I'm too old now to be scared of doing right. We're facing a long fight, but we're gathering strength. The truth has its own power, and it's drawing people to our cause. Update 3. The Winstons are fighting dirty now, which tells me we're winning. Their high-priced legal team has been busy. They've filed motions to dismiss, claiming statute of limitations. They've questioned the authenticity of our documents. And now they're going after my family's character. Yesterday, my mother called, her voice shaking with anger. They had someone at my job, Levi, asking questions about me, about your father, about our criminal history. My mother, Darlene Lester, is an administrator at a hospital in Jackson, 20 years without a blemish on her record. asking questions about me, about your father, about our criminal history. My mother, Darlene Lester, is an administrator at a hospital in Jackson, 20 years without a blemish on her record. My father, before he passed, was a deacon in our church and a postal worker. What criminal history? I asked, already knowing the answer. Exactly, she said, but they're digging up everything they can. Your cousin Marcus's drug charge from 15 years ago. That time your Uncle James got arrested at a protest. They're painting us as troublemakers, criminals. It's a classic tactic. Discredit the victims to justify the crime against them. Make it seem like they deserved what happened. But the Winstons didn't stop there. Two of our witnesses, former plantation workers who had agreed to testify about the oral history of the land theft, called to withdraw. They wouldn't say why, but Joseph Taylor knew. They're threatening jobs, he told me when we met in the safety of his church again. Not just folks who work for them directly, but they're calling in favors with other businesses in town. People can't feed their families on principle, son. I couldn't blame the witnesses, but it was a blow to our case. Then came the offer. Richard Winston's lawyer, a slick Harvard graduate named Bradford Mills, requested a meeting. We met at a neutral location, a conference room at the Holiday Inn Express just off the highway. Mills, with his perfect teeth and $1,000 suit, slid a document across the table. My clients are prepared to offer a generous settlement, he said, his voice practiced in false sincerity. $200,000. In exchange for your silence and the surrender of all claims to the land. I looked at the paper but didn't touch it. Silence. You think you can buy my history? My family's dignity? Mills leaned back, unbothered. I think $200,000 would make a nice start to your life after college. Perhaps fund law school. You clearly have a passion for justice. The casual way he tried to co-opt my dreams made my blood boil, but I kept my face neutral. The land is worth millions, I pointed out. The land isn't on offer, Mills replied smoothly. Just the inconvenience payment, shall we say. I stood up, gathering my belongings. The land is exactly what's on offer, Mr. Mills. It always has been. Your clients stole it, and we're taking it back. Later, Aisha Johnson, my attorney, called the offer a promising sign of weakness. They're scared, Levi, she said, her voice energized. That's a good sign. They wouldn't offer a penny if they weren't worried about losing it all. They should be, I replied. We're not taking their blood money. We're going to trial. The judge has set a date for 3 months from now. It will be the first time a Winston has had to answer for their crimes against my family in a court of law. In preparation, we've been gathering more evidence. Dr. Washington has found tax records showing the suspicious timing of the Winston plantation's expansion right after my ancestors' land was seized. We've located 3 more descendants of students from Elaine's secret school, all willing to testify about the oral history passed down in their families. And I've been spending time with Joseph Taylor, recording his memories and the stories passed down from his grandfather. His testimony about the boundaries, the schoolhouse location, and the reputation of both families in the community will be powerful. You remind me of her, you know, Joseph told me yesterday as we walked the perimeter of what was once Lester land. Of Elaine, from the stories. How so? I asked, surprised. He smiled, the Mississippi sun highlighting the deep lines of his face. Stubborn as a mule, but in the good way. The kind of stubborn that outlasts evil. I hope he's right, because the Winstons have had their way for generations, and they won't give up what they've stolen without a fierce fight. But neither will I. Update 4. In my final update, we won. After 155 years, the land is coming home. The trial lasted 2 weeks. 10 days of testimony, evidence, expert witnesses, and barely restrained hostility from the Winston family, who attended every day. Their faces set in scowls of entitlement and disbelief. On the final day, as we awaited the judge's ruling, the courtroom was packed. My family filled 2 rows, cousins, aunts, uncles, some I'd only met during this process. Behind the Winstons sat the county's elite, old money families with surnames that appeared on street signs and building plaques. Judge Marilyn Douglas, a black woman in her 60s who had worked her way up from public defender to the federal bench, entered the courtroom, and everyone rose. Her expression gave nothing away as she took her seat and adjusted her glasses. In the case of Lester versus Winston, she began, her voice clear and deliberate, this court has carefully considered all evidence presented by both parties. She detailed the land purchased by James and Elaine Lester in 1868, the documented payment, the fraudulent debt claims by Richard Winston I, the intimidation tactics, and the seizure of the property. She referenced the expert testimony on the pattern of similar thefts throughout the South during Reconstruction. The evidence presented clearly demonstrates a pattern of fraudulent land acquisition, Judge Douglas continued. The statute of limitations does not apply in this case under the doctrine of fraudulent concealment. As the Winston family actively suppressed evidence of the original ownership and threatened those who might speak out. I felt my grandmother's hand grip mine tightly. I could hear my mother's breath catch. The court hereby restores the Lester family's rightful ownership of the 186 acres in question, including all structures thereon, with the exception of the main plantation house, which was built after the land seizure and is not subject to this claim. The courtroom erupted. My family members embraced each other, some crying openly. The Winstons sat in stunned silence before Richard Winston IV stood abruptly and stormed out, his wife and children following. Only their lawyer remained, already preparing their appeal, no doubt. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. They thrust microphones toward me, asking how it felt, what we planned to do with the land. Richard Winston pushed through the crowd, his face mottled with rage. For a moment, I thought he might actually strike me, but he stopped short, jabbing a finger toward my face instead. "This isn't over," he snarled. "That land has been Winston land for generations. The appeals court will overturn this travesty." I looked at him calmly, aware of the cameras, of my family watching, of the weight of this moment. "Mr. Winston," I said, "this isn't about revenge. It's about justice. It's about reclaiming what was stolen, not just land, but our history, our dignity. Your family took more than property from mine. You took possibilities, futures, dreams." I paused, then continued, "But Elaine Lester still planted seeds of hope when she started teaching children in secret. She knew education was the way forward. And here I am, a Howard University student, using what I've learned to right this wrong. The cycle is complete." Winston's face remained hard, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps the first recognition that the world he'd always known, where his name guaranteed power, was changing. As promised, the Winstons appealed, but 3 months later, the appeals court upheld Judge Douglas's ruling. The land was ours, irrevocably. Last weekend, we held a ceremony on the property. Over 100 people came, family members, allies, community members. Joseph Taylor was there, using a cane but standing proud as we unveiled a plaque honoring Elaine Lester and her secret school. The most moving moment came when Aunt Ruby, at 92 the oldest living Lester, walked the land with her walker. She'd been born into sharecropping on this very soil, picking cotton as a child for pennies a day. Elaine would be so proud, she said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she reached out to touch the plaque. She always told us to keep learning, keep fighting. Said one day we'd come home. We're restoring the small building that once housed Elaine's school, turning it into a museum and educational center. The rest of the land will be partly farmed. We're establishing a cooperative for local black farmers who've been marginalized by industrial agriculture, and partly used for affordable housing for families in need. The Winstons still own the big house, still have wealth and influence. But something fundamental has changed. A precedent has been set. Already, 2 other families in the county have contacted us about pursuing similar claims. As for me, I've changed my plans after graduation. I've been accepted to law school, where I plan to specialize in historical land claims and reparative justice. There are thousands of stories like ours, thousands of families waiting for justice. The Lester legacy isn't just about land. It's about perseverance, education, and the long arc of justice that Elaine believed in so fiercely. She started a school because she knew knowledge was power. Today, we're using that power to rebuild what was taken, not just for ourselves, but for all those still waiting for justice. The land has come home. And so have we.